Welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I want to talk about the biggest gaps in F1 between teammates since 2008. So for this video, I was actually planning to do something a bit different. I was going to have a look at Red Bull, see what they should do with their second seat. Of course, with a lot of news swirling about Perez, Colapinto, Lawson, Sonoda, etc. So I thought that was an interesting video, but news over the last week or so has always seemed to put cold water on that, and it always seems like Perez is just going to hold on to that seat for 2025. So we need something else to talk about, and for one last video before the Vegas Grand Prix this coming weekend, I decided to talk about the 15 biggest gaps between F1 teammates since 2008 using the data from my race model. So this is not just gaps between points, as that can be quite misleading if you do it by percentage or favor backmarkers. If you do it by just raw difference, that'll favor front running cars. So it uses my race model, which is basically scored as basically two standard deviations. So basically a score of 4 would be 2 standard deviations, a score of 2 would be 1 standard deviation. And my model also uses things like average finishing position, as well as overtake, which is basically how well they can move through the field from their starting position relative to how strong their car is. So today we're going to be looking at the 15 biggest gaps according to that model. And I've also put points and as well as championship position. So let's get started. So I think number 15, we're going to start right away. Albon and Sargent from 2024. As of the recording of this video, Albon 16th in the championship, Sargent 22nd. Of course, Sargent has already basically been kicked out of F1 at this point, but of course those championship positions could still change. Points 4 for Albon, 0 for Sargent, with a score in my model of 2.98. And of course, if this is the 2024 score, you can probably guess that 2023 is also going to be on this list. But yeah, not great from the pair of them. Sargent was definitely closer in qualifying and closer than last year. But still, the gap, especially in finishing position difference, was very, very big, and that has a massive effect on why Sargent was so far down on this list. All right, number 14, Sainz and Kvyat in 2017. So this one's a bit interesting. So Sainz finishes 9th in the championship that year. Kvyat finishes 19th, 48 points for Sainz, 4 points for Kvyat during their time as teammates. Of course, this was a bit of a strange year, as Kvyat was basically dropped early, and Sainz was basically shipped to Renault several races early. So this was a head-to-head that didn't even last the full season. The score in my model is 3.01. Sainz had a very, very good year that year, was a consistent point scorer, and was generally close to the front of the midfield for most of that season, I remember. Not quite at the same level as the Force Indias consistently, but basically after that, he was really the best of that next group. Whereas Kvyat, on the other hand, not a ton of pace, really crash prone, a ton of incidents that year. I remember just off the top of my head, Austria, where he took out both Verstappen and Alonso at the first corner as being one of them. But yeah, of course, Kvyat, after he was dropped from Red Bull back to Toro Rosso, definitely very, very inconsistent pace-wise, and yeah, race model did not look particularly kind on him in 2017. Number 13, Alonso and Raikkonen 2014. Interestingly enough, this is a season I'm watching on F1 TV right now. You can definitely see Raikkonen really struggles, often 4 or 5 positions behind Alonso in the races. Alonso very, very consistent, generally doing the best he could with what he could with the car. Of course, well behind Mercedes that year, well behind even the Red Bull and the Williams, but really after that, those 3 teams, he was generally doing his best to kind of mix it up with them from time to time, whereas Raikkonen was really struggling to get points. At the end of the year, Alonso 6th in the championship, 12 points, 6th in the championship, 161 points. Raikkonen 12th in the championship, only 55 points. So Alonso has almost 3 times more points than him, and in the race model, score of 3.22. All right, moving on to number 12, and this is our first of our Max Verstappen's. spoiler, there's going to be more than one here. But Verstappen, Perez 2023. Verstappen, of course, won the championship last year. Perez did hold on to second place. It was a bit close in the end between himself and Lewis Hamilton. But for Verstappen, 575 points. That's an all-time record. I don't think that's going to be beaten anytime soon unless they change the point system or add sprints to every race. And for Perez, 285 points, almost 300 points behind his teammate. Score, the gap in my race model, 3.45. And for Verstappen, of course, I've talked about this, a lot last year and as well this year, but, he basically had an exceptional year, won almost every race bar 3. And for Perez, the start of the year was pretty good, but really fell off hard. And towards the second half of the season was really struggling to just even get on the podium, which is basically kind of a microcosm of, or foreteller of what was to come this year in 2024. But yeah, not a great year from Perez, especially given how strong that car was. And I think, this year would have actually been quite a bit higher in the model if you didn't have the ceiling effects. And ceiling effects, if you don't know, are basically in any kind of, statistics or any kind of system, where you're basically hitting a ceiling and you can't actually go any higher. So it doesn't actually truly represent the true difference between, in this case, Verstappen and Perez. Verstappen was basically stuck in P1. You can't get P0, but he would be, 20, 30 seconds ahead of everyone else, whereas the car was so strong that Perez was still able to get P2, P3. But, for example, in finishing position, that true difference wouldn't really come out. All right, number 11, Verstappen and Gasly 2019. So this was, again, not a full season, only 12 races, I think it was. Verstappen third in the championship at the end of the year. Gasly 7th, although I do believe he was 6th when he was dropped from Red Bull and, put back in the Toro Rosso. Over there during those 12 races as teammates, Verstappen 181 points, Gasly 63 points. Score in my race model, 3.51. Gasly had a pretty rough 12 races there. Really struggled in races, overtaking other cars, would often get stuck behind much slower midfield cars. I remember watching the 2019 Canadian Grand Prix live, and Gasly basically got himself stuck behind Stroll in a pretty slow racing point that year and just couldn't get past him. So yeah, for Gasly, really struggled in races. Qualifying wasn't so bad, but again, this is a model that focuses specifically on the races, so qualifying isn't really a big factor here. But yeah, and then of course dropped after the Hungarian Grand Prix. I think after he was lapped at that race and was lapped a couple races previously by his teammate Max Verstappen. So pretty rough year that year for Gasly. All right, moving on into the top 10, we have Albon and Sargent, Part 1. Albon, of course, finished 13th in the championship that year. For Sargent, he finished 21st in the 20-driver championship. Of course, I think Nick DeVries also finished 22nd in 20-driver championship, so that joke extends to him. But points gap was pretty ugly, 27-1 in favor of Albon, and the race model score was a 3.58. And again, really similar in terms of just general comments to 2024. Albon had a pretty good year last year, was generally towards the front of that backpack of 4 cars or whatever it was last year, whereas for Sargent, he was generally towards the back of that pack. So again, really massive difference in terms of average finishing position between the two of them. All right, number 9, we have Gasly and Tsunoda 2021, but for Gasly, at least fortunately for him, he was on the positive side of this teammate battle. He finished 9th in the championship with 110 points, whereas his rookie teammate, of course, Yuki Tsunoda, finished 14th with 32 points. Race model score 3.63, and it was a pretty big walloping by Gasly. Gasly had a very good year. That AlphaTauri that year was very good. At times it was on the pace of the McLaren and the Ferrari, but not always. And Gasly had some excellent performances, particularly in qualifying, but again, that wouldn't really translate into the model because it is a race model. For Tsunoda, pretty inconsistent year. Qualifying was pretty bad, but in the races he just wasn't getting that many points. He would often qualify pretty poorly, well outside the top 10, and then just was not able to kind of get his way back into those point-paying positions where Gasly was consistently getting P7, P8, a few P5s and P6s there as well. I think as well for Tsunoda, the team forced him to move from the UK, I guess where the Red Bull junior team had their kind of dormitories, if you want to call it that, and they actually made him move to Italy just to try to, force him to actually have a routine and, treat F1 like a full-time job. So, Tsunoda definitely had a pretty rough rookie year, but of course he has improved quite a lot since then. All right, number 8, Rosberg and Nakajima from 2009. Rosberg finished 7th in the championship that year, 34.5 points. Again, that was in the old point system. Under the current point system, that would have been 95 points. For Nakajima, he finished 20th in the championship, so way behind Rosberg. Had no points, but if they were using the 2010 point system, I think the 2019 point system with the extra point for fastest lap, he would have had 5 points. Score difference 3.8, so pretty massive there. This was a season I haven't watched. I didn't watch live and I haven't watched it on F1 TV, so hard for me to really comment on. But they were basically just looking at the stats. They looked like they were basically driving in different formula. Rosberg was generally in the mix in the midfield and doing a pretty good job. Whereas for Nakajima, he was basically racing around with the back markers, looking at just finishing positions, starting positions, and stuff. All right, number 7, Verstappen Perez 2021. So for Verstappen, of course, won the championship that year. 395.5 points. For Perez, 4th, 190 points. Score on my race model, 3.85. For Perez, he does get a bit of slack for this year, given that it was his first year at Red Bull. And of course, for most drivers, there is a little bit of an adjustment period. That being said, Verstappen was excellent that year. Actually had less points than he probably should have, given how many incidents he had with Hamilton / Bottas, plus the tire failure in Baku as well. For Perez, he was okay. Obviously he's remembered for his great defending in Turkey as well as in Abu Dhabi, but for the most part he was pretty poor in qualifying and would have to have these great recovery drives where he would basically get back to like 4th or 5th place, as the Red Bull and the Mercedes were miles clear of every other car in F1 that year. Number 6, Alonso and Massa 2012. So I was kind of surprised that there was only 1 year for Alonso and Massa that made the cut for the top 15. But for Alonso, he finished 2nd in the championship, 278 points. He came very, very close to winning his 3rd F1 title. For Massa, he finished 7th, 122 points. Race model score 3.86. For Alonso, he was excellent that year, very, very consistent, just did a really good job of making the most out of the Ferrari. It was a really strange year though. The Pirelli tires were quite strange. So the Ferraris were often pretty bad in qualifying, but were much, much quicker in races. So if you look at the gap between their best starting positions and their finishing positions, it's one of the biggest in this time frame from 2008 to 2024. And for Massa, he also really struggled at the beginning of the year, was barely scoring any points, whereas Alonso was winning races, challenging for wins. I think Massa did get a little bit better as the season went along, and Alonso did have a couple mistakes and some misfortune as well, such as the Belgian Grand Prix where he kind of got Grosjean'd, and at the Japanese Grand Prix where I think he made a pretty costly mistake on the opening lap there. All right, number 5, again, sticking with Fernando Alonso, this time for 2009 when he was teamed up with Nelson Piquet Jr. For Alonso, he finished 9th in the championship that year for Renault, 26 points under that point system. Under the current point system, it would have been 40. For Piquet Jr., he finished 21st, no points, and under today's point system, that would have been 1 point. And again, this was only half a season, as Piquet basically left the team as kind of the Crashgate scandal was starting to kind of become known to the public. For Piquet Jr., it was a pretty bad year. He had an okay rookie season 2008, but this half season 2009 was pretty awful. And I'm sure perhaps the effects of Crashgate and whatever might have had a toll on him as well. But yeah, pretty bad, and race model score 3.95. So moving into the top 4, next we have Vettel and Bourdais from 2008. Now, of course, this year is often remembered for Vettel winning the Italian Grand Prix, and that definitely did have an effect on the points gap between the two of them. But Vettel actually had a really, really good year, specifically in the second half of the season, where he was getting consistent 4th, 5th, 6th place finishes, and just picking up really solid points, whereas Bourdais was not doing so much of that. For Vettel, he finished 8th in the championship, 35 points. Under today's system, that would have been 93. And for Bourdais, he finished 17th in the championship with only 4 points. And even under today's system, that's only 14. So a gap 93 points to 14 is still a pretty massive gap between teammates. And that score difference was a 4.26, so fourth biggest of the data that I have. All right, moving into the top three. Number 3, we actually have Verstappen and Albon from 2020. For Verstappen, he finished 3rd in the championship, 214 points, whereas for Albon, in his one full season at Red Bull, he finished 7th with 105 points. Race model score, 4.26. So this is a point where you're getting above 2 standard deviations. That's like basically 98th and a half percentile. So these are, very, very extreme teammate gaps here. For Verstappen, he had an excellent year, was basically consistently racing the Mercedes, more often Bottas than Hamilton, but was generally kind of in a league of his own where you had the Hambot or podium joke that went around that entire season. For Albon, definitely struggled. That Red Bull was a very tricky car, had a very unstable rear, but for Albon, he spent, I think, too much of the year fighting in the midfield, fighting cars that were, I think, clearly slower, including the Renault, the Racing Point that year, the Tracing Point jokes, but even fighting the sister car of the Toro Rosso. And then I think infamously at the Eiffel Grand Prix, he had that very poorly worded radio message where he said that they were racing me too hard, and I think that definitely kind of felt like the nail on the coffin for him. But yeah, for L1, pretty bad year, and that leads to being ranked 3rd on his list. He, of course, took 2021 off, and then, of course, rejoined F1 with Williams in 2022. Alright, moving up to number 2 on our list. Number 2, we have Robert Kubica and Vitaly Petrov from 2010. For Kubica, ranked 8th in the championship that year, 136 points. For Petrov's 13th in the championship, 27 points. And this teammate head-to-head has a score of 4.31. My teammate, or my race model score. For Kubica, very, very good season. Didn't win a race that year, but did have a couple of pretty good podium finishes and was generally fighting towards, not necessarily the front because he wasn't winning, didn't win any races and didn't get that many podiums, but he was doing a really good job of basically finishing, 4th, 5th, 6th, and just getting really consistent points throughout the season. Whereas for Petrov, really struggled, very inconsistent as well. Did get a little bit better as the season went along, and of course was infamously or famously, depending on your perspective, known for holding up Fernando Alonso at the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix at the end of the year. Now, that moves us on to number 1, and I think kind of the reason I'm deciding to make this video now is, perhaps you'll kind of know where I'm going with this, but number 1, as of the recording of this video, is Verstappen and Perez 2024. Now, for Verstappen, currently 1st in the championship, 393 points. For Perez, 8th in the championship, 151 points. Score on my race model, 4.33. That is the biggest single gap between teammates in my race model since 2008, which is definitely saying something. And yeah, I think it really just highlights how poorly Perez has driven this year. I think Verstappen's generally been performing very, very well, and something that I kind of mentioned earlier with the ceiling effects, where the Red Bull was so good that it was basically kind of masking some of Perez's deficiencies on some of the key stats I use in the model, whereas this year that's definitely not the case. The finishing position difference, I think, between Verstappen and Perez is close to 4 or 5. Points gap is, pretty clear to see. It's about 250 points or so. Don't think it's going to be bigger than last year, but just because Verstappen hasn't been able to get as many points as he did last year. But you can definitely see that, Perez is performing at a pretty poor level. So poor that, again, like I said, worst result ever in my model. Of course, things could improve for Perez, and this score could go down in the final 3 races of the season. But of course, that's something that's yet to be seen. And again, I think the reality is, with Perez performing as he is, I really don't think that Red Bull, except for, reasons that start with an M, end with a Y, they don't really have there aren't really any good reasons to keep Perez along for 2025. He's definitely costing Red Bull, I think, at least one position in the constructors probably too. I was doing some tinkering with numbers about this, and for example, if Perez finished exactly 2 positions behind Verstappen every single Grand Prix, and this was I think before the triple header, it might have been in the middle of the triple header, Red Bull would have still been leading the constructors championship. So really, really, a head scratching decision I think on Red Bull's part to keep Perez. I think we all kind of know why that is, but I think at the same time it's frustrating as a fan and definitely as on someone like me who makes videos and stuff. Where you clearly see you want to see the best drivers and the best cars, and when drivers aren't performing, not necessarily kicking them out of the sport, but you kind of would prefer that they're in a lower ranking team that's more suitable to their current abilities. So, for example, the fact that Sainz is going to be racing a pretty slow Williams in 2025, where Perez is still going to be racing a very very fast Red Bull in 2025 is I think a bit of a travesty. But then anyway, let me know your thoughts. What are your thoughts on this list? Do you agree, disagree? Again, this isn't my own opinion. This is just kind of me ranking them by the score in my race model. But do you agree with the list? Do you disagree with the list? Are there any others that you think should have been on this list? Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.